very early on in their relationship when Harry is bowled over by Meghan, is desperately in love.
What she allowed it to become, which I think was unforgivable, was a tirade against the racist royal family.
The question really is whether Harry realizes himself.
It started like a fairy tale, but what if that fairy tale was already cracking before the vows were even spoken? Because behind the glowing smiles of Meghan Markle and Prince Harry, behind the global applause, behind the illusion of perfection, there were whispers. Quiet, controlled, almost invisible, but they were there. And according to Tom Bauer, those whispers weren't random, they were warnings no one wanted to hear. The world saw a once-in-a-generation spectacle, a royal wedding wrapped in elegance, history, and emotion. Cameras captured every perfect angle, every step timed, every glance meaningful. But what the world didn't see was what was already happening behind the scenes, because while headlines screamed modern love story inside royal circles, something else was quietly unfolding. Not chaos, not scandal. Something more dangerous, doubt. Not loud, dramatic doubt. No headlines, no confrontations, just a slow, creeping unease building in private conversations. The kind that doesn't explode, it lingers. It waits. And here's where it gets uncomfortable, because this tension didn't start after the wedding. It didn't come later with hindsight. It was already there before everything became official, before the dress, before the vows, before the world locked this story in as a perfect fairy tale. That detail alone changes everything, because if people inside the system were already questioning things, what exactly were they seeing that the rest of the world wasn't? Small signals. That's how it began. Not one big red flag, no dramatic moment, just tiny shifts, subtle decisions that didn't quite align with royal tradition, interactions that felt slightly off, not enough to cause a scene, but enough to raise eyebrows behind closed doors. The kind of details that never make headlines but quietly build a pattern. And patterns are where the truth hides. Because while insiders were quietly connecting dots, the public narrative was moving in the opposite direction. Louder, brighter, stronger. A love story, a modern monarchy, a new era. Everything polished, everything certain. But here's the contradiction. How can something look so perfect on the outside while uncertainty is growing on the inside? That tension didn't appear out of nowhere. It traces back further, earlier, before the engagement, before the headlines, even before that so-called chance meeting, because what if it wasn't chance at all? According to Bauer's account, the story of how Meghan Markle entered Prince Harry's world might not be as spontaneous as it was presented. The public was told it was effortless, a blind date, a natural connection, simple, clean, almost cinematic. But when you look closer, that simplicity starts to feel a little too perfect, because long before that meeting in London, there were moves being made, quiet moves, strategic ones. From around 2013, after her previous marriage ended, Meghan's environment began to shift, subtly at first. Then, more clearly, her circle expanded. Wealth, influence, visibility. Step by step, she moved closer to a world where connections weren't just helpful, they were everything. And then suddenly, she meets Harry. But here's the detail that refuses to stay quiet. Bauer suggests she didn't walk into that meeting blindly. She understood him, not just the public prince, the private man, his passions, his causes, Africa, conservation, humanitarian work. These weren't random interests. They were central to who he was. And according to this version of events, they were studied. Because if everything looked perfect, why was everything changing underneath? And if those changes started before the wedding even happened, then what exactly was already set in motion? Something was shifting. Quietly, powerfully, and the world didn't even notice. And just when it seemed like the cracks couldn't get any more visible, the wedding itself quietly exposed everything the world refused to question. Because while millions were watching the spectacle at St. George's Chapel, while the cameras captured elegance, precision, and history unfolding in real time, something far more revealing was hiding in plain sight. Not in what was shown, but in what was missing. Start with the guest list. On the surface, it looked dazzling. Global icons, Hollywood elites, powerful media figures, names that instantly elevated the event beyond a royal ceremony into a worldwide cultural moment. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Many of those high-profile guests had little to no real connection to the couple before that day. Their presence wasn't rooted in history, it was rooted in visibility. And when visibility becomes more important than familiarity, the question shifts from celebration to intention. Because on the other side of that same list, there was silence. Friends, longtime companions of Prince Harry, people who had been part of his life for years, missing, not just from the spotlight, but from intimate moments, private gatherings, the kind of spaces where loyalty usually matters most. Their absence distance didn't need explanation. It spoke loudly on its own. And for those who understood royal tradition, where relationships are built over decades, not headlines, that absence felt unnatural. It felt deliberate. And then came the detail that no amount of ceremony could hide. Because as Meghan Markle walked down the aisle, there was a void that cameras could not ignore. Her father, Thomas Markle, was not there. The moment that should have been deeply symbolic, gone, replaced, rewritten. Yes, the public was given an explanation. Health issues, a heart attack, media chaos involving staged photographs, a sudden crisis that made attendance impossible. But according to the deeper narrative explored by Tom Bower, that distance didn't begin in those final days. It had already been growing, quietly, gradually, long before the headlines forced it into the open. And it wasn't just her father, her brother, her sister, extended family, almost entirely absent, replaced by a single figure, her mother, Doria Ragland, sitting alone in a sea of royalty, celebrities, and global attention. Her calm presence was undeniable, but so was the emptiness around her. Think about that for a second. A wedding meant to symbolize unity between families where one entire side is nearly invisible. And inside royal circles, this didn't go unnoticed. It couldn't. Because when family is missing from a moment built on tradition, it raises questions no ceremony can silence. Questions about relationships, about timing, about choices that were made long before the world ever saw the final result. Even King Charles III stepping in to walk Meghan part of the way down the aisle, while symbolic and supportive, only highlighted the gap further. It filled the moment visually, but it didn't answer the deeper question, why was that gap there in the first place? And while the world focused on the beauty of the ceremony, inside the palace, something else was unfolding. Pressure, not the kind you see on camera, the kind that builds behind closed doors. Because according to multiple accounts examined by Tom Bower, the months leading up to that May 2018 wedding were not smooth. They were intense, demanding, exhausting. Staff, people who had handled royal events for years, found themselves navigating something entirely different this time. Instructions kept changing. Details were revisited repeatedly. Expectations remained high, but clarity didn't always follow. What should have been structured became unpredictable. And when structure collapses inside an institution built on precision, the effect is immediate. People felt it. Some staff reportedly became cautious, careful in their words, careful in their actions, not because they lacked experience, but because the environment itself had shifted. The usual confidence was replaced with uncertainty. And when professionals start second-guessing themselves, it's no longer just about workload. It's about pressure that goes deeper. At the center of it all was Meghan's hands-on approach. Specific, detailed, controlled. And while that level of involvement can be seen as commitment, inside a system that thrives on hierarchy and tradition, it created friction. Because this wasn't just planning a wedding, it was challenging a structure that had existed for generations. And friction always leaves marks. Even small disagreements like those surrounding bridesmaid dresses carried more weight than they should have. Not because the issues themselves were huge, but because they were happening inside an already strained environment. Each moment added another layer, another crack. And yet, none of this reached the public, because outside, everything looked flawless. Which brings us to the most unsettling realization of all. What if the wedding was never just a wedding? What if it was something bigger? Because according to Bower's perspective, this wasn't just a personal milestone, it was a global platform, a stage unlike any other. Millions watching, every detail analyzed, every image remembered. And in that kind of environment, nothing is accidental. Every choice carries meaning. The guest list, the setting, the symbolism, even the emotional tone, it all contributes to a narrative. A carefully constructed image that doesn't just reflect reality, but shapes it. And suddenly, the entire event starts to feel different. Not less emotional, not less real, but more intentional. Because when you combine everything, the preparation before meeting Harry, the speed of the relationship, the shifting social circle, the curated guest list, the family absence, the pressure behind the scenes, it stops looking like isolated moments. It starts looking like a pattern moving in one direction, forward, upward, strategic. And then there's the comparison that stirred something even deeper. Princess Diana. The parallels were everywhere, in media, in public perception, in the emotional framing of the story. Meghan wasn't just entering the royal family, she was being placed into a narrative already filled with legacy, pain, and global admiration. And for many, that comparison felt powerful. But inside the palace, it created discomfort, because Diana's story wasn't built results overnight. It was shaped through years of public service, struggle, and deeply personal experiences. To see that legacy echoed so early, so quickly, it raised questions about whether the narrative was being shaped rather than naturally formed. And that leads directly to the most controversial possibility of all. What if this was never meant to end at the altar? What if the wedding was just the beginning? Because if you look at everything through that lens, it starts to connect. The global exposure, the powerful networks, the visibility that extends far beyond royalty into media, business, influence. It becomes more than a ceremony. It becomes an entry point, a gateway to something bigger. And if even a fraction of that perspective holds truth, then the story the world celebrated wasn't just about love. It was about positioning, about access, about a future that was already being built long before the vows were spoken. So now the question isn't simple anymore. Was this a genuine love story that unfolded naturally, or a perfectly timed alignment of ambition, opportunity, and influence? Because the most unsettling part isn't what we saw, it's what we didn't. And maybe that's exactly how it was meant to be. Because even now, years later, the story still doesn't feel finished. It feels like something that started quietly, is still unfolding in ways the world hasn't fully understood yet.